When I say state-sponsored terrorism, it'll probably bring a few countries or events to mind depending on one's politics or nationality, but it is hard to even pin down an exact definition of state-sponsored terror and what states would qualify, because it varies on who you ask. But for the purposes of this video, we will be using the bare-bones definition of terrorism, the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially used against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. Recognizing in the case that we will be talking about, it was not a state sponsoring another group to commit terror, as is often the case. It was a state directly acting itself, using its own intelligence services to carry out an act of terror directly. This is the story of how the French government carried out the first terrorist attack in New Zealand's history. On the night of July the 10th, 1985, the crew of the Rainbow Warrior was gathered on board their ship docked in Auckland Harbor to celebrate the birthday of one of their crewmates. The crew had other reasons to be celebrating. The ship had only just arrived from Florida that year, and in mid-May had already successfully transported 300 islanders of Rongelap Atoll to another island that was not contaminated by radiation from nuclear testing. The Rainbow Warrior, as the name might imply, was part of the Greenpeace fleet in the Pacific. Greenpeace, depending on who you ask, are an environmental protection, non-governmental organization, which was then focused on anti-nuclear weapons activities, such as helping evacuate Pacific Islanders who were exposed to radiation from nuclear tests. Yeah, so it may be worse than I actually originally thought, because the US dropped these bombs literally right next to the people on that island. The crew's next mission was to be the flagship in a fleet sent to protest the testing of nuclear weapons by the French government by sailing their ships to Morora Atoll in French Polynesia and essentially causing a nuisance to the French who were trying to test nuclear weapons there. This was not the first time this had happened, as in 1972, a Greenpeace vessel sailed into the exclusion zone of the same atoll to disrupt the tests. They were eventually detained by French forces. This would also annoy the French enough they would take steps to prevent it happening in the future. As the crew was celebrating the night of July 10th, they were not aware the French government had actually had a spy infiltrate the birthday party and had been reporting their movements. The crew eventually retired, some going ashore while others went to bed, and some stayed awake chatting in the mess room. At precisely 23:38, a limpet mine attached to the hull below the waterline exploded, followed several minutes later by a second bomb. Most of the crew was able to escape, but a photographer, Fernando Pereira, drowned after the second explosion sank the ship. It was the first terrorist attack in New Zealand's history, and it had been carried out by a country supposedly allied with New Zealand. Within the next day, New Zealand's Security Intelligence Service, their equivalent of the CIA, was involved after realizing this had been an act of terrorism due to the political nature surrounding the Greenpeace group and this obvious act of violence against them. It quickly came to light there was a suspicious amount of French people involved with the incident, and it became apparent to the investigators that they had had some government backing as they had sophisticated false documentation. And within several days, the NZSIS was confident that DGSE was involved. That is the Directorate General for External Security, the French equivalent to the British MI6 or the American CIA. From New Zealand's perspective, it was either impressively fast they discovered it was France, or from France's perspective, shamefully fast, which was made worse by the fact that the French would immediately deny it, even though the New Zealanders were very confident the French were behind the incident. France's Operation Satanique, as they called it, became a disaster for France.
Hans, I've just noticed something.
These communists are all cowards.
Have you looked at our caps recently?
Our caps?
The badges on our caps. Have you looked at them?
What? No. A bit?
They've got skulls on them. Have you noticed that our caps have actually got little pictures of skulls on them?
I don't,
Hans, are we the baddies?
Later, according to them, their goal had been to just sink the ship, which was bad in and of itself, but they had accidentally gotten someone killed in the second explosion. It was made even more embarrassing for the DGSE that, while only 2 agents were arrested, all of the agents involved were quickly identified, which is obviously something you don't want to happen to you as a spy. For instance, after planting the bombs, someone was seen suspiciously dragging a dinghy up the beach to a van. The locals who spotted this curious happening then informed the police of the activity. The 2 agents waiting in this van would end up being the only 2 to be arrested, due to the police searching for the van after the locals had tipped them off about suspicious activity. And in part because, according to the NZSIS, the sloppiness of their driver's licenses, sloppiness of their passports, And notably, something that particularly baffled New Zealand investigators was the fact that the French tried to return the van to get their money back instead of just fleeing the country, thus directly leading to their capture. The agent getting into the van managed to get away, as well as the spy on board the boat made it to Tahiti. But that is not the extent of the French team. There was also the group that came to New Zealand on the yacht Uvea. Their mission was to covertly bring in supplies needed to destroy the Rainbow Warrior, mainly the limpet magnetic mines that would be used to sink the boat. They left the New Zealand coast the night of July 9th, the day before the attack, but not first without acting suspicious enough, for their behavior did not fit the mold of the typical deep-sea yachts who frequented the area, and drew the suspicion of the police. I guess unloading mines to your companions on shore might do that. But even though they had left the night before, the NZ-SIS was on their trail as they left Whangarei Harbour, New Zealand, for Norfolk Island, which is part of Australia. The crew was actually interviewed by police, but due to it being so early on, and some other bungling of the early investigation, the crew was allowed to continue on to Australia proper. By the time New Zealand realized they actually wanted to arrest the crew of the ship, which had brought explosives into their country, they had already made it to Australia and escaped by hopping on board the French nuclear submarine Rubis, which had come to pick them up. New Zealand was understandably upset with what they knew the French government had just done, and equally upset that they were denying responsibility, as an increasing list of French nationals had warrants issued for their arrest by New Zealand, and a growing interest of reporters. By at least the end of July, it was public knowledge that France must have been behind the attack. In August, the French were forced to go so far as to publish a fake internal investigation saying they did not do it, which understandably infuriated New Zealand even further. After a growing mountain of evidence had accumulated by mid-September, thanks in part to French media, the French defense minister, Charles Hernu, was forced to resign on September 20th. Admiral Pierre Lacoste, the head of DGSE, was fired, and on 22nd of September, the French Prime Minister finally had to admit that the agents of the DGSE sank this boat. They acted on orders. It would not come to light for 25 years how high the plan went within the French government, but in 2005, Le Monde, the French newspaper, reported that Admiral Pierre Lacoste, the then head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, had gotten direct approval from President Mitterrand, making the decision come from the absolute top of French government to commit an act of terror in New Zealand. The two agents arrested had pleaded guilty to manslaughter and were sentenced to 10 years in prison in November of 1985. France was somewhat extremely ticked off by this chain of events and demanded its agents returned, as they saw them as agents just carrying out orders and not criminals. Interesting interpretation. This led to the French government using its economic power to threaten New Zealand with an embargo that would block all of its exports to Europe, which was 20% of all New Zealand's exports. This somewhat brash reaction by the French forced New Zealand to make a compromise deal. In July 1986, the agreement led to the French paying $7 million to New Zealand, a formal apology from the French Prime Minister, and a promise to not interfere with New Zealand's exports. In return, New Zealand would have to turn over the two arrested agents to the French, who pinky swore to keep them in prison on the French island of Hao Atoll for 3 years. New Zealand felt compelled to accept despite public outcry and fear their entire economy would suffer due to France's threats. In not an unexpected turn, considering France's actions during all of this, the two agents were released early and allowed to return to France, which of course technically violated the treaty which had been arbitrated by the United Nations, which then forced both countries back into another round of arbitration chaired by the Secretary General of the United Nations, in which New Zealand was awarded a further $2 million, but this time in the form of a New Zealand-France Friendship Fund. In 1987, France was forced to give Greenpeace its own separate reparations to the tune of $8.2 million, as well as compensating the family of the man killed. Greenpeace would use the funds to finance the Rainbow Warrior 2. The organization would also send ships to protest the upcoming nuclear test, which did in fact continue. The overall event would greatly shift public opinion in New Zealand and the South Pacific against the test carried out by the French, and who would eventually stop the test in the 90s. In 2015, the last interesting event connected with the story occurred. One of the agents involved came out and publicly apologized for his actions, stating, "Now that emotions have calmed, and with the hindsight I have regarding my professional life, I thought that this was a chance for me to express both my deepest regrets and my apologies, in saying the mission was not meant to harm anyone. I have the blood of an innocent man on my conscience, and that weighs on me. It is not an apology from everyone who took part, but it is at least something, even if it is 30 years late." What became of the Rainbow Warrior itself, you ask? It was refloated so a forensic investigation could take place, and it was determined it was not worth repairing, as it was already quite an old ship being put to sea in 1955 in Britain. So it was taken to Martari Bay, New Zealand, and scuttled, so it could become a dive wreck and an artificial reef. A fitting end for a Greenpeace vessel, I should think. But it also makes one wonder what competent intelligence agencies can accomplish, and what we will never know about.